welcome everybody. This is today our 16th ITMN Tree Mortality Seminar. So we are very, very happy to have Anna Trugman with us today here. And Anna is a professor, assistant professor at UC Santa Barbara. And this year she also won the Tensley Medal Award by New Phytologist. She has done her PhD in Princeton University and did a postdoc at University of Utah. Anna will talk about plant physiology and how this is integrated into tree mortality today. And before she starts her talk, I also want to highlight again that this time or during her talk, if you have questions that arise, please post them in the chat. And at the end of the talk, we either ask the questions from the chat or you can also directly ask questions to Anna. So please all welcome to the seminar, and Anna, the floor is yours now.
Thanks so much, Nadine, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Just before I start, if it seems like there's any audio or tech problems, feel free to shout at me. Otherwise, I might not know that it's happening. So I'm Anna Trugman. I'm an assistant professor in the geography department at UC Santa Barbara. And today I'm going to talk to you about integrating plant physiology and community ecology across scales through trait-based models with an eye towards drought mortality prediction. And before I get started, I just want to thank the members of my lab group and my collaborators, as well as my funding sources. And I'm going to highlight some of their work today when I'm talking. So I don't think I really need to motivate why forests are such an amazing resource to this group, but they host the vast majority of this planet's biodiversity. And from an Earth system perspective, they modulate surface energy fluxes, the hydrological cycle, and the terrestrial carbon cycle. And when thinking about their role in the terrestrial carbon cycle, they have this enormous potential to help mitigate anthropogenic climate change. So this is a picture of the global carbon cycle over time. And you can see on the y-axis net emissions due to fossil fuel burning and land use change. And the carbon from these emissions can go into three main pools in the Earth system. This carbon can go into the ocean. And if you look, the amount going into the ocean is increasing as emissions have ramped up, but it's not varying a lot on short timescales. This carbon can go into the atmosphere. And this is what I think of when I think of anthropogenic climate change, is rapidly rising atmospheric CO2. But if you actually look at the amount going into the atmosphere year to year, it's highly variable. And the reason it's so variable are plants, terrestrial ecosystems, and because productivity is very sensitive to changes in climate, and you also get changes in mortality in response to changing climatic conditions. And if we're looking forward to understand how this piece of the terrestrial carbon cycle might change with future climate change, it's actually really uncertain. On the one hand, with increased atmospheric CO2, you expect increased productivity. So these are two separate simulations from the coupled model intercomparison project, phase 5. One has the radiative effect of CO2, so the climate effect, but not the physiological effect on plants. And you can see slight declines in productivity by the end of the century as a result of this climate change. But if you add in the physiological benefit of CO2, these models predict a strong increase in net primary productivity. But actually, one thing that's really important is the global land surface models don't really have a sophisticated representation of different mortality processes due to things like drought, insect, or fire disturbance. And these climate-driven die-offs are really important, not only from an ecological perspective, but from a climate perspective, because they have the potential to release a large amount of carbon back into the atmosphere within a relatively short time period and cause a positive feedback on climate change. And I'm sure many folks in this Zoom room are familiar with this figure, but this is a map of major drought and heat-induced mortality events over the past several decades. And each one of these points represents a mortality event that could release a large amount of carbon into the atmosphere and cause a positive feedback on climate change. And looking forward, there's potential for this to get much worse. So we expect changes in precipitation with climate change that are relatively uncertain. But as you warm the atmosphere, you also increase the amount of moisture the atmosphere can hold. And this increases vapor pressure deficit, which puts additional stress on trees. And it's expected for this vapor pressure deficit to increase globally. And so today I'm going to break my talk into roughly two parts. The first part is using an understanding of plant physiology incorporated in trait-based models to try and predict biogeographic patterns in response to changes in water availability across the continental US. And then I'm going to talk some more about future directions in measurements and trait-based models that I see as really important moving forward. And I just want to start out with a pitch for why trait-based ecosystem models are really useful for understanding drought and disturbance-driven mortality. First of all, they reflect our underlying ecophysiological responses to climate variations. And they have a lot of potential for predicting responses to novel climate regimes because of this underlying ecophysiology. They can account for plant functional diversity rooted in physiology and allow for easy assimilation of a wealth of trait data that is increasingly measured and available in these large-scale trait databases. And they're a really useful platform for numerical experiments that can help to generate and evaluate hypotheses that we have about the physiology and ecology, and provide this kind of iterative feedback loop between modelers and ecophysiologists that really allow us to get at the underlying mechanisms that are most important for driving forest responses to climate change. And so when thinking about drought and drought responses, plant hydraulic traits are of central importance because plant hydraulic traits affect productivity and the movement of water between the land surface and the atmosphere. So briefly, water travels along this water potential gradient from the soil through the tree and is transpired into the atmosphere. And changes in either soil water potential or atmospheric vapor pressure deficit can affect the internal tree xylem sap pressure. And what's shown here is what happens to the conductivity in a tree as the xylem sap pressure becomes more negative. So this tree, as we increase water stress, moves from like 0% loss in conductivity up to potentially 100%, which or a very high losses in conductivity, which correspond to mortality in trees. And what's really important from a trait-based modeling perspective is that different trees have more resistant or more vulnerable xylems, and they'll lose different amounts of conductivity for the exact same xylem sap pressure. So in this case, we have this more drought vulnerable pinyon shown in red here, and a more drought resistant juniper. And a plant hydraulic trait that's reflective of this difference and is incorporated in process-based models to represent these losses in conductivity with changes in xylem sap pressure is P50, or the pressure at which 50% conductivity is lost. And I'm going to come back to this trait throughout the talk when talking about some of the modeling work that I'm doing. And so my group previously developed maps of plant hydraulic traits like P50 using forest inventory data from the US Forest Inventory and Analysis database. And we developed these maps looking at community weighted mean plant hydraulic traits like P50, where we weighted the P50 based on different species basal area and their corresponding species average traits. And just to orient you here, less negative P50s correspond to more drought vulnerable species and communities that are comprised of more drought vulnerable species. and more negative values correspond to communities comprised of individual trees with predominantly more drought-resistant traits. And if you're familiar with the climate of the US, where it's actually much drier in the Western United States, and you have a lot more precipitation in the Eastern United States, this trait-based map makes a lot of sense from a physiological perspective. So we have these eastern forests where there's a lot of precipitation and maybe water isn't the most limiting resource. They have communities comprised of much more drought vulnerable individuals. And in the Western United States, where water is really pretty scarce, we see these trees that are much more resistant to water stress. And in addition to capturing these community-weighted traits, we also developed maps of the hydraulic diversity within plots across the US, and then within climate grid cells, which in this exercise that I'm doing from a modeling perspective is 1/4 of a degree. So at the equator, that corresponds to about 25 kilometers on one box size. And so when we were looking at the within plot most drought vulnerable species, this was the individual tree with the least negative P50 value recorded in a plot. And then we averaged that for a particular climate grid cell. And the converse for the most within plot, most drought resistant. And then we also wanted to look at if we were looking at potentially proximal seed sources that could seed in over time within that climate grid cell, what was the most extreme in terms of drought vulnerability within that 25 roughly kilometer grid box, and the most drought resistant individual. And in particular, we wanted to look at how do hydraulic traits and trait diversity mediate plant water status and stress across the climate gradient of the continental US? Are there key regions that may become more or less vulnerable to drought stress with climate change? And to what extent can current forest trait reservoirs, and that we defined as the traits within a 1/4 degree climate grid cell, buffer future increases in water stress? And so we used an optimization-based tree model that includes a realistic representation of gas exchange, detailed representation of plant hydraulics. In the model, photosynthesis is a function of physiology and climate, and it predicts how environmental conditions impact plant hydraulic function and carbon gain. We ran this model on a daily time step, and the meteorological forcing includes photosynthetically active radiation, temperature, root zone, soil water potential, atmospheric vapor pressure deficit, and CO2. And outputs include a number of really useful physiological diagnostics that we can use to understand how climate is impacting stress and productivity. This includes transpiration, net carbon assimilation, plant water potentials, which are a useful diagnostic of water status, and plant loss and hydraulic conductivity, which is a useful diagnostic of hydraulic stress. Previously, we've validated this model against a number of physiological diagnostics and observations. I'm not going to go into the validations too much here, but I'm happy to discuss them further with anyone. And in particular, with our experiments, we wanted to ask 2 main questions, focused first on how traits mediate climate stress. And so we use this plant hydraulics model parameterized with the plant hydraulic trait maps that I showed, as well as the range of trait diversity that we were observing within a climate grid cell and within a plot derived from the US Forest Inventory and Analysis plot network. And then we also looked at the impact of current and future climate on forest stress. And so to do this, we ran the model over a 20-year period at daily time steps during a historical period from 1995 to 2014, and then a future period along SSP 3-70 between 2080 and 2100. And SSP 3-70 is is a kind of intermediate to high level climate change scenario that results in about 3.6 degrees C warming by the end of the century. And so these are some model outputs that are from our historical simulations. This is the average stressed water potential during the historical 20-year simulation. So it's the 10th percentile in terms of the driest number of days during this 20-year period. And this map, if you're familiar with the climate of the US, where it's wetter on the East Coast and drier on the West Coast, makes a lot of sense. So yellower values correspond to more tension in the leaves, and we can see we have less negative water potentials in the leaves on the East Coast, where there's a lot more water availability, and species have P50s that are much less negative. So the trees can't sustain as much water stress. And then in the Western US, where it's much drier, we can see much more negative water potentials in some cases in these pinyon juniper woodlands. But actually, the leaf water potential predictions don't correspond one-to-one with stress. And so this is the 10th percentile most stressed days on this map during the historical period, where pinker values correspond to higher stress. And we can see on the East Coast, where the leaf water potentials were much less negative than the West. In some cases, we have slightly more losses in conductivity compared to our Western counterparts because of the much more negative P50s in the species on the West Coast of the United States compared to the East. And then there's also this corridor in the central United States where we found pretty large losses in conductivity that are potentially due to riparian areas where there's subsurface water subsidies that aren't represented in our soil moisture forcing. And this is something I'll talk about when I'm talking about future directions and understanding what roots and plant available water is from a process-based perspective. And so we actually ran these continental scale simulations for a number of iterations of these different P50 and other hydraulic trait maps corresponding to the most vulnerable species that we found within a climate grid cell to the least vulnerable species. And this is a kind of cross-section of the different percent losses in conductivity we found corresponding with these most vulnerable and least vulnerable trait compositions, where just to orient you, higher values correspond to higher stress. And if we looked at the most vulnerable hydraulic trait composition within a climate forcing grid cell, we found pretty extreme losses in conductivity compared to the community weighted mean maps that were much more moderate losses in conductivity for the mode corresponding to about 20%. And the least vulnerable plants within a climate grid cell, which had really pretty minimal losses in conductivity. And because we're doing future projections with this SSP 3-70, we wanted to understand if this model PLC was a useful diagnostic for stress. And one way to kind of look at that is to see if we're capturing mortality patterns in the forest inventory database. And so we compared mortality at a particular grid cell from the forest inventory in terms of percent basal area, which is shown on the y-axis here, compared to model percent loss in conductivity. And our plant hydraulics model actually did a good job capturing locations where there was elevated mortality using elevated plant or percent losses in conductivity. And if we did kind of this same exercise using a drought mortality index like SPEI to try and identify grid cells where there should be elevated mortality, where more negative SPEI values correspond to more severe droughts, we actually didn't find any sort of difference in percent basal area mortality in the FIA. So this indicates that the plant hydraulics model is actually more useful than just some standard drought index based on soil moisture, or in the case of SE, potential evapotranspiration and precipitation, because we don't see some clear difference between these two different populations in terms of basal area mortality. So now this is a change in percent loss in conductivity between our average extremes from the future minus historical. And so redder values here indicate more increased stress with climate change. And blue values here indicate less stress with climate change. And so we found pretty systematic increases in percent losses in conductivity, both during extreme events and just in terms of daily background stress, which could really contribute to processes like cavitation fatigue and increase the baseline vulnerability of plants in many of the locations across the continental US. And I should mention processes like xylem fatigue are not incorporated in this model, or really in a lot of cases, any process-based plant hydraulics model. And so it's something to consider as an important factor, but could layer on additional stress beyond what we see here. And if we actually break down what's happening region by region and look at which forcings are responsible for each of the patterns in stress across the US, we can look to see the full effect of all of the different climate forcings. Blue corresponds to the ameliorating effect of elevated CO2 on stress. And you can see it if you look in panels B through E, that there is a small ameliorating effect in terms of PLC space due to CO2. There's really a pretty minimal effect due to temperature, which you can see in each of the panels B through E, and a fairly large vapor pressure deficit effect, but it does actually vary depending on if you're in the central Western US, the Northwest, or the East Coast. And so then we wanted to do an exercise looking at if hydraulic diversity is sufficient to protect forest against increases in climate stress. And so what we did was we tried to preserve historical levels of stress and looked to see if any of the trait reservoir in terms of the hydraulic traits within a particular hydraulic grid cell were sufficient to keep historical levels relative to what we found in the community weighted mean during the historical period. And this figure is a little complicated, so I'm going to walk you through piece by piece. But pink values here correspond to all trees being able to cope with future climate stress. Gray values correspond with no trees being able to cope with the future climate stress. And so you might expect transitions away from a forested area. This pie chart indicates the fraction of grid cells in each category. And the orange to gray and brownish colors correspond to at least some shift that you might require in terms of forest composition to maintain historical levels of stress. And so, well, there's a relatively minimal number of grid cells, maybe about 20%, where no trees could cope with the climate stress, mainly focused in the Western United States. Overwhelmingly, we found that it was required to have at least some shift in terms of forest composition to maintain historical levels of stress. And we were actually able to then compare our model predictions to what we found in the forest inventory, because the US forest inventories are remeasured at either 5 or 10-year time periods. And this has been systematized since approximately year 2000. And so we were able to look at what we call this trait velocity, or change in P50 over time, which is shown in this panel C on the bottom right, and compare it to what we found in the forest inventory. And just to orient you, negative values correspond to more drought hardy forest compositions. And so in the observations, which are shown in gray here, we did find a slight shift towards more drought hardy forest compositions, but it was actually an order of magnitude less than what we found in our simulations, which are shown in blue. And we actually did another iteration where we allowed for adaptive acclimation in leaf area in our plant hydraulics model, and that had some ameliorating effect in terms of changes in stress, and that's shown in red, but it was still required more of a trait shift than we found in the observations. So just to summarize this first section, both climate and hydraulic traits mediate patterns of current water status and water stress. Climate change has the potential to increase stress. Many forests may require at least some shift in species composition to mediate this stress. And hydraulic trait diversity in the US has the potential to protect ecosystems against increased risk in some locations. But the observed current changes that we found in the forest inventory are not keeping pace with required turnovers to mitigate climate stress. And so now I want to talk about some future directions in both the work that we're doing in my lab and other researchers are doing, both for measurements and trait-based models. And so I showed you some simulations based on species averages and community weighted means that we've mapped to forest inventory to parameterize our models. But I think there's still a lot of ongoing questions about within species variability in different traits and how they mediate vulnerability both during the life cycle of a tree and across space. And so I'm working with collaborators, Adrian Das, Nate Stevenson, Lee Andrag, and actually all of this work is headed by graduate student Indra Boving, where we're sampling across an elevational gradient in Sequoia Kings Canyon in California, Sierra Nevada mountains, to try and get a hold of within species variability in hydraulic traits. This is a map of some of the demographic plots where we're making our trait measurements, and these plots have almost 30 years of data in some cases about demographic rates and also insect infestation in these trees. So it's a really powerful platform to then try and link our traits through models to demographic rates. We've just started this project, but we've completed one field season mainly focused on sampling white fir in this case. And this is Indra here climbing some of these trees, which have these massive canopies that you actually have to, we have to rig using a bow and arrow and then climb up to access the leaves to measure things like water potential and photosynthetic rate. This is just a sneak peek at some of our data where we've deployed hobos in both the understory and canopy trees to look at how microclimate might be varying. This is for vapor pressure deficit along these 5 different plots for both our understory and canopy trees of the same species. And here's a look at some of the water potential data for the larger and smaller trees for midday water potential, and P50 is about around -3 for these trees. So actually there's a pretty large hydraulic safety margin that we found during this summer, which is fairly surprising given that the past summer was really pretty dry. And we actually didn't find as large of a difference between understory and canopy trees as we had expected. And so that project is ongoing. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about future directions in trait-based modeling for tree mortality prediction. And so one thing I mentioned during my past, the biogeographic experiments was really understanding what plant available water is. And I think this is a really difficult problem, both for measurements and for modeling, is figuring out what the roots are doing and where they're getting their water from. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for some iterative feedback between field-based measurements and modeling, particularly because it's just so difficult to sample the subsurface. And so there's been some really interesting and innovative work. This study, for example, by Erica McCormick, attempted to map where trees are getting water from bedrock across the United States using an ET precipitation balance approach. And so they've mapped years where bedrock water is withdrawn roughly every year over a 1.5 decade period, where it's sometimes required and where it's not needed. And so these types of data sets have a lot of potential to be used to forest land surface models in some cases, where you have trait-based vegetation models incorporated in these land surface models. There's also been some really interesting studies looking at trying to figure out what root distributions are looking at from a combined modeling and above ground sampling perspective to see where roots need to be in a particular soil layer to produce the water potentials that we're observing above ground during some particular precipitation regime. I think there's a lot of room to look into additional physiological unknowns like intraspecific trait variability and also processes like drought, damage, and recovery. And so this is kind of highlighting a potential hypothesis that my group worked on, trying to figure out possible mechanisms that might explain why we see lagged mortality events after drought and even sometimes pretty normal growth. These are some observations of dying and surviving trees in Colorado after a major drought event where they had very similar growth rings up to 8 years post-drought, and then a significant number of the trees died. And we used a complementary modeling exercise that included recovery of damaged xylem to try and explain this lagged mortality and similar normalized ring width. And so including some of these processes in larger scale land surface models that are used potentially in a coupled climate context could be really useful for understanding changes in drought mortality and also improving carbon cycle prediction. And then incorporating and understanding process-based disturbances in larger scale models that are used for climate prediction. So we already know that forest disturbance risks are increasing with climate change. Some people in this Zoom room have been doing some of the really innovative work at examining this. And it's actually also expected as we move forward, even though risks have already increased, that they may increase dramatically more. And so I'm going to use a few examples from the field. One close to my home in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where I grew up, to illustrate why this is important. And these ponderosa pine forests have been really hammered by all of the kind of key disturbances we think about with water limited systems and climate change, including fire, drought, and mountain pine beetles. And Nate McDowell and colleagues actually did this really interesting experiment where they exposed pinyon trees to end of century projected climates that were really quite extreme. So a 4°C warming without any sort of CO2 fertilization and 45% precipitation reduction experiment. So this is arguably like more extreme than we expect these trees to have to deal with. And actually, not a single tree in this study died. And it's really interesting if you look at this map of where we're seeing pine beetle mortality across the Western United States and place this experiment in the context of all of this beetle mortality. There's a really pretty extreme level of mountain pine beetle mortality, but none of these trees, a key point is none of the trees in the study were infected by pine beetles. So a lot of these processes require like layering of drought and insect infestation or fire and drought. And so figuring out the really dynamic and coupled process between these different disturbance drivers, I think is really important. And folks are doing a lot of innovative work, and we need to figure out how to translate it into our carbon cycle predictions. Another example from a little closer to home is actually at these plots that I showed earlier that Indra is working with. And through collaboration with Nate Stevenson and Adrian Doss. This shows the P50 value, this trait that's a metric of hydraulic vulnerability across incense cedar, black oak, and ponderosa pine, which are three main species at these plots. And based on P50, you might expect incense cedar to be the most vulnerable and ponderosa pine to be the least vulnerable. But if you actually look at the observed mortality during the recent or relatively recent drought in California, and you can see that the incense cedar, which you actually would expect to be the least vulnerable to mortality, as small tree size classes died at the highest rate. And this was mainly due actually to native bark beetle infestation, which we were able to diagnose because of the wealth of data that Nate Stevenson and Adrian Doss have collected at these plots. And in the case of the larger trees, the main mortality in ponderosa pine was also due to bark beetles. So mortality was driven by native bark beetles, and host selection differed strongly by size class, both within and among species. And so when thinking about biotic agents and mortality predictions, they not only have the potential to kind of elevate mortality levels above what one would expect based on hydraulics alone, but in some cases they can reorder vulnerability of species. And, I think there's a number of really innovative modeling techniques for looking at insect mortality at landscape levels and thinking about how we would like to translate these to models that might run at a 0.5 degree grid cell or more is a really important step for translating the ecological impacts of tree mortality into carbon cycle predictions that can help us understand climate change trends. And I finally want to wrap up by talking a little bit about fire. And so the Western US has actually experienced dramatic changes in fire just over the past several decades. And if we move forward from 2017, where this map ends, we've been hitting record-setting years in California in particular, every year or every other year in terms of fire size. So it's becoming a major problem that actually the entire continent of the US is sometimes blanketed in smoke to a certain extent from Western wildfires. And we know that climate change is increasing fire risk. So this is based on a study led by Bill Endrag using some statistical modeling looking at fire on the landscape across the US for black is showing the historical fire rate, and then our projections are shown for ranging from low emissions to high emissions scenarios. And you can see that regardless of the scenario, it's expected that there will potentially be a dramatic increase in fire, even above what we're seeing now. But there are obviously limitations associated with statistical models and the dynamic feedback between forest distributions, and fire is a really important aspect to capture. And so we also have really innovative techniques of understanding this, particularly at smaller scales, but figuring out how to make sure that it's systematically incorporated in our larger scale forecasts, which a number of folks are working on actively right now, I think is really important. So just to summarize this last section, major unknowns that need to be addressed on both observational and modeling fronts include understanding intraspecific trait variability and plant acclimation or adaptation to climate change conditions. And we really need to get a better grasp on this before we can really constrain fully if this is an important mechanism to include in process-based models. Understanding the subsurface and plant available water. And I think there's a lot of innovative work going on here using both models and above ground observations to get at this problem because it's just very tricky to measure the subsurface. And then disturbance interactions with drought stress. So with that, I'll wrap up and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Anna, for this wonderful, wonderful talk. I am sure that there's a lot of questions. You gave a lot of inspiring outlooks here also in the second section. I particularly enjoyed you kind of looking ahead a lot in your talk. I want to break the ice with a question that I had, and then we sort of move into the other. So, I mean, you talked a lot about traits in the first part, and particularly about the P50. But then I was kind of wondering, I mean, are there other traits that you think that we should focus on? I mean, you mentioned rooting and rooting strategies and rooting depth. I guess my question comes from the perspective that I think we're doing a good job in measuring some traits or focusing on some, but not on others. And I'm interested to hear your perspective on, you know, where we should look in terms of getting a better understanding of the traits and their distribution and their
yeah, that's a great question. And I think from the hydraulics perspective, one of the big problems with the hydraulics models is parameterizing conductivity and Kmax in particular. And so K-native or is supposed to be like prognostic from the model, but some of the results are really sensitive to what value you choose for Kmax, and you know, there like potentially should be some you need some sort of trade-off in model world to otherwise it might be optimal for plants to basically have as high a Kmax as possible and as negative of a P50 as possible, which we know is not like really physiologically realistic if you are a person going out in the field measuring those values. But coming up with that trade-off in model world from the data is actually, it's not very well constrained, and you can have really different results in stress depending on which value is chosen. And I think there have been a few different studies by like Martin Daca, and I think any of the larger land surface models with plant hydraulics have kind of struggled with parameterizing that. And so figuring out the most translatable value like what is the most relevant value from the field too, because there's even some debate on how you measure that trait, I think is a important area that the plant hydraulics folks would could use more help in from, but you know, that's certainly not comprehensive of all of the traits. I think if one's thinking about coupling trait-based modeling to some of these disturbance processes in a tractable way, particularly like the pests and pathogens, I think there has been not as much progress to date as we'd hoped, because it's a really tricky problem, but figuring out how to group things into some category and like map them to some plant traits, maybe just to capture the 2 or 3 big players at first would be a fruitful way of going about that. And it's maybe not quite as much of a like hard physiological trait, but you could consider it potentially a trait-based effect.
Yeah, thanks so much. We need to start somewhere, right? That's a good verdict in the end. Everybody, I mean, feel free to ask questions. I mean, either type them in the thread or make yourself visible and unmute yourself. There's one question in the thread already by Indira Paudel, who asks about the hydraulic trait diversity and whether you think why that's not sufficient to buffer some of the climate change effects in all places. I don't know, maybe you could respond to that in some form.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so what we were doing with that experiment really is we had maps of like all of these different forest inventory plots across the US, and our model forcing data set, which I think we were using the NDLAS, North American Land Surface Database, to force the soil moisture and other climate variables. That gridded data set is available at 1/4 degree. And so we were basically looking at all of the plots within that 1/4 degree climate forcing, what the total like trait reservoir was within that grid cell, with an idea that potentially you could get some seeding in of proximal species that were maybe more resistant to drought stress if allowed enough time. But there are also limits to dispersion. So we considered that kind of the available traits that might allow for different forests to compensate for increasing stress. And then we looked to see if we swapped in like those most drought resistant traits, did we still see an increase in stress within that grid cell based on the future climate forcing along SSP 3-70, which is an intermediate to high forcing scenario that results in about a 3.6 degree warming by the end of the century. So it's higher than like what COP has recommended that we hit, but we're actually not really on track at this point in time for that recommendation. And so it's a potentially reasonable assumption at this point. And so if there were no traits within that grid cell that could compensate for the increase in climate stress, then we classified that grid cell as like potential to transition from some sort of forested area to, like some sort of more semi-arid vegetation like grass or chaparral. And then we also allowed for like stronger shifts in species composition towards more drought resistant plants. And I think there are a lot of assumptions, obviously, with classifying that, no traits could accommodate that increase in stress, but it's actually a really tricky problem to predict from first principles how you might expect biogeographic changes to respond to climate stress. And so I think it's a fairly reasonable guiding experiment to help folks think about it.
Well, thanks for that. I think that has a very, very nice answer.
I have a question.
Yes, wonderful. Somebody speaks up. I like that. Please, Michel, go ahead.
Well, my question was on changes in tree, not physiological traits, but architectural traits. I mean, first, which was documented, is some deeper water uptake by trees with increasing aridity, and particularly in the Mediterranean area, it has been correctly documented. And second, what we documented in our research is a reduction of the leaf area and branching rate that makes the trees, which changes the rate between the ratio between roots and leaves, with a higher ratio for roots compared to leaves. But this is a very long-term evolution, so it means that the the old trees will not change much of this ratio, but the young trees which are growing now may on the long term change this ratio, which is very important for tree stress in case of drought. So can something like that be included in some models so that what we are predicting for the end of the century may not be only physiological changes, but also architectural changes in trees?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And I didn't get into it in detail because I didn't have time, but that architectural change that you mentioned is actually this, this pink PDF here.
Okay.
So we did, and so as I'm sure you know, it's actually pretty hard to quantify or predict exactly how much of a shift that will occur in terms of like leaf area to sapwood area, or so Huber value, or leaf to roots. So we used an optimization based approach where we optimized leaf area to maximize carbon gain over the 20-year future period. And we did a separate optimization over the historical period. And that actually acclimation in leaf area does have substantial potential to mediate stress, but it still doesn't fully mediate all of the future climate stress that we expect to see, at least in the United States. And so I think there are some ways to incorporate processes like you mentioned, but our models are only as good as our understanding. And so I think there's a lot of room for more process-based understanding there to figure out what the important axes are for architectural changes or other plant adaptations within a species. And then I want to get to your question about roots, but I'm not sure I fully understand what the question was there. So is it like adaptations in rooting depth with changes in climate, like so a similar architectural change, or were you getting at something else?
For the tree, the branch architecture, we have a very, very huge database which has not been published up to now because we're still working on that. We have lots of data from 16 countries and thousands of trees. So I need to finalize that, but this will give, I think, something quite useful, because we found with all the colleagues from all the countries on many species that all the trees in all the ecosystems were more or less reacting exactly the same way. So that can be a good thing. And okay, for roots, I have less data. Also, I worked a lot on roots, but the roots of trees are highly adaptable to the water availability, depending on soil. So no species has a specific root design. The root design, the root architecture of each tree depends on where water and nutrients are available, not on the species itself.
Yeah, and actually, so Scott McKay in this new phytologist study, I think did a pretty nice experimental design. It's not a a regional simulation, but he diagnosed with the model combined with a bunch of above ground physiological diagnostics where the tree root needs to be to sustain function during like the different drought events through which they measured. And he found this like really interesting result that the taproot really needs to have been established prior to the drought event, that the plant doesn't really have enough available carbon to try and deepen its roots during some sort of drought event. But yeah, the like architecture is of fundamental importance, and you might expect these changes in like trees with different rooting depths within a species, but you can't really dynamically adapt that architecture as a tree to respond to stress over a shorter time period. And I would say like we do have certainly in larger scale models and land surface models, and I would imagine in even like landscape scale models, rooting depth is a plant functional trait, so it's not accommodating for the process you're speaking to right now. But I think there's a lot of potential to do these kind of careful point simulations to try and get a little bit more at that architectural question in the subsurface.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Also from my side, there's a question in the chat by Hu Ying Shu, actually two questions. Do you observe patterns of hydraulic trait diversity along climate gradients? And how do you estimate trait velocity?
Yeah, great question. So we do actually find some pretty notable patterns in hydraulic trait diversity across the US that actually don't correspond to overall species diversity. And so, so in the Western US in particular, where there's a lot more water limitation, we see a lot wider range in like P50, so a lot more hydraulic trait diversity compared to the Eastern US, where water isn't always the limiting resource, and the Eastern US has a much wider species diversity. And so, I think this is probably indicative of different drought avoidant versus drought tolerant strategies in the Western US. It's also a pretty topographically diverse location that I think can generate a lot of that hydraulic diversity. And then for the trait velocities, what we did was we looked at the community weighted mean P50 value and how it changed between the earliest forest inventory measurement and the most recent forest inventory measurement. And so that gives you like megapascal changes per year. And so for the Eastern United States, the inventories are remeasured once every 5 years. Because this is a state level measurement and the states are much smaller on the Eastern US. And then for the Western US, those plots are remeasured every 10 years. And so that's reflective for most states on the Western US of just for a second inventory minus the first, and on the Eastern US, it's usually like third minus first. But great question, thank you.
Wonderful. We would have time for one more, if there is one more question. This does not seem the case. Well, then let me close this session. Thanks again, Anna, for this wonderful, inspiring talk and also for answering the great questions. Thanks everybody for being here. Thanks for asking questions and being part of this. And I can already announce the next tree mortality seminar, which will be on the 18th of April at 4 p.m. Central European time. And we will have Arthur Gessler from the WSL with us. So looking forward to see you then. And thanks again, Anna, for this wonderful talk and for being with us today.
Thank you so much.